Thanks for joining me today. My name is Tobias and I'm going to teach you how to use AWS Lambda. Before we get into the tutorials though, I just want to cover some information about what the service is. We'll talk about what Lambda is, what serverless computing is, how it works, what the supported languages are, the configuration options, the really cool features that make it even more powerful, how to trigger Lambda from other AWS services, what some of the benefits are, and use cases. Okay, so at a high level, AWS Lambda is a serverless computing service that lets you run functions without having to manage servers. That's the big idea here, is that you can run function code without having to manage servers. And that's really what makes it serverless in their definition. So what this enables you to do is you can focus on writing code versus managing infrastructure. It also means that you only have to pay for what you use. You don't have to pay for servers sitting there idly. You only pay for every time your function is invoked, which is pretty cool. And you don't have to worry about capacity or uptime. Amazon takes care of all those details for you. Okay? Oops, there we go. So moving on here, what is serverless computing? So serverless computing, clearly there are servers somewhere, right? But what it really means is that you as the individual, you as the person writing function code here, you don't have to manage those servers. Amazon will do it for you. As I mentioned, that is a drastic cost saving dimension, right? Because you're no longer paying for idle servers. If you remember back, before serverless computing, you had to build these kind of reliable, fault-tolerant architectures, which meant that you might have multiple servers running in different data centers, and those servers may or may not be utilized properly, right? They may have very low utilization rates, and that drives the cost higher. But here with serverless, Amazon, you kind of offload all that, so Amazon takes care of that for you. You focus on writing your code, etc. And this can apply to a large number of use cases, so it's not just for web apps. It can be used for data processing and analytics, you name it. I mean, there's a ton of use cases for this. So how does it actually work from just the end user perspective, right? Well, all you have to do as an individual is you write your function code, make sure it's written per their specification because there are some details about the code that you need to follow. But once you do that, then you upload it to the service and then you invoke it. So you can invoke it manually through like the AWS CLI or through the AWS console, or you can invoke it through an application. You might have some other code somewhere that says, hey, go start off this function. Or it can be triggered by an event, and we will get to this later, but essentially, let's just say something gets uploaded to an S3 bucket. You can configure that to kick off and start a Lambda function and process that object. So that's how it works. It's pretty simple. It does support a limited number of languages. I say limited because it's not every language in the world. It does cover the ones you see here, which fits a lot of different applications and needs. I think you'd agree that you can build a lot of different and interesting systems with these. So Node, Python, Ruby, Java, Go, .NET Core. There are a number of configuration options that you can set to tune Lambda to your needs. The first one being memory. Some functions might need more memory to do their job, and so you can configure the memory footprint to be either from the default of 128 megabytes all the way up to 10,240 megabytes. The next one we have is IAM roles. So the function uses a role permission configuration to communicate with other AWS services. So if your function is going to, say, read something from DynamoDB, you configure that in the IAM role settings, and then you're good to go. By default, Lambda isn't connected to VPC, but it can. So let's say you have some servers and a VPC subnet somewhere, and for whatever reason you want VPC or you want Lambda to work with those, then you can connect the Lambda to that VPC and you're good to go. By default, Lambda is connected to CloudWatch. So if you're writing a function and you want to log something, let's say an error, then you can configure that in your function. And then when you invoke the Lambda function, you can just jump over to CloudWatch and read the logs and find out what's going on. There is a timeout on functions, so they won't just run forever. You know, you can configure that from 1 second all the way up to 15 minutes. And this is helpful because if you have like a hung process or something's not working right, then you can make sure that the Lambda doesn't keep running forever. And then lastly, there is ephemeral storage. So if you need some sort of working space in your Lambda, you can configure the ephemeral storage all the way up to 10,240 megabytes to suit your needs. Okay, moving on here. So just some cool features that I like. There is a feature called layers, Lambda layers. And this allows you to create, let's just say you're using Python and there was some package that you needed like scikit. You can create a Lambda layer of that, and then once it's up on the Lambda service, you can then import that layer into any number of functions that you want and use that layer. So it's a way of creating like a Lambda specific, shared library, if you will, that you can access. You can also do container deployments. So right now, the way it works is you write your code, you upload it to Lambda, or you upload it to S3, and then Lambda will basically create the function for you. But if you want more kind of control over the whole environment, and you want to maybe just streamline your deployment process to suit your needs, then you can create containers and then use those and deploy those to Lambda to run your function code. And one of the cool things that just came out not too long ago was URL functions. Previously, if you wanted to invoke a Lambda, you had to use code. You had to invoke it either through the AWS CLI, through an event, or some other means. But URL functions allow you to basically access it over the internet. You could do it in a browser or through other tools like curl or whatnot. And I thought it's a very convenient way to interact with some of your functions. And then there is super tight integrations with other AWS services, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And actually, we'll get into that right now. So there's this concept in cloud computing called event-based computing. And essentially what that is that if an event happens somewhere, you want things to kind of respond to that. So if there is an object uploaded to S3, then there can be an event fired, and then Lambda can be started or invoked from that event, and it can process some details about that event. And so Lambda supports a number of different triggers. Here's a list of, there are more, and you can see more in the documentation. But this is primarily a way to create, event-based computing architectures. And Lambda is, the code part of that, the function part of that. So what can Lambda be used for? There's, essentially endless number of use cases. It can be used for what you see here, data processing, real-time file processing, web application backends. Really, it's just up to your imagination how you want to use it. It's kind of like the Excel of cloud computing, right? Where if you need to run some code somewhere for something, there's a way to do it with Lambda, right? So think big with this, and then make sure you know how to use it. It's in your utility belt. And then just a summary on the benefits. So it is cost effective because you're only paying for the time that your function is invoked and how long it is managed by Amazon, so you're no longer having to worry about upgrading Windows servers or Ubuntu Linux servers. It is easy to use. There are some things you have to learn about how to upload code and how to get it all to kind of work together, but once you go through that learning process, then it becomes very quick to use. And it is integrated with all the other Amazon services, which is nice because, once you're working with one cloud provider, it's great when it's easy to use all their different services together. So with that, now I'm going to get into 2 demos on showing you how to use AWS Lambda in the console. Let's jump in and create a function now. So I'm on the Lambda dashboard page, and you can go there yourself. When you're there, click on the Create Function button, and it opens up this wizard. So I'm going to choose the first option here, author from scratch. There are a few others, but we won't get into those now. I'll give my function a name, and then I'll choose a runtime. So here are the latest supported versions of each runtime, and I'm going to choose the Python version. And then I'll leave the settings default. So this will end up creating an AWS IAM role and configure it for me, and I'm going to go ahead and choose that option. Okay, this is the function editor and configuration page. There's a lot here, and I'm not going to go over everything at this point. I'm going to jump straight to the coding part. So that's where this row of options or this row of menu items are, and you just use the code menu. This is the actual function that will run for this Lambda. They have a default one built for us, which is nice. Right now, you do have to have a function, an actual function, so it can't just be just a plain old Python file, or it can't be a class. It has to be a function, and that has to accept two objects, so it has to accept the event and the context. The event is information that it can be passed to the Lambda, so like a payload, and the context is information about that invocation of the function. So let's just go ahead and run this and see what happens. If we click on test, this allows us to run the function. We will give it a name. We'll keep it private, and we'll keep their example payload information here. Let's go ahead and save that. And then once it's saved, we should be able to then just click this button and it will run it. So you can see the information here, the name of the test, the response, which if you go back to our function, is simply the return of this information here. And then some information from CloudWatch about the logging information. Okay, now what if we change this a little bit and we said, let's go ahead and print the event, okay? And then what if we configured our test event and we said my data XYZ, and then we'll get rid of these other two items here. Okay, then we go ahead and save that. And then let's close that and let's run this again. Well, actually, first we have to deploy our changes. So click on the deploy button, and then we can test it again. And then you can see here, it looks similar, right? So there's the test name, there's the response. But if you look at the logs, here's our print statement, my data XYZ, and that was supplied by our test event. Okay, let's do another change. Let's, instead of printing the event, why don't we print the context and see what's in the context? So we'll change that, we'll deploy the changes, and then we'll click test again, and then we can see our context information, and that's this line here. It's kind of hard to read here, but you see request ID, you see a log group name, you see a log stream name, and you can kind of scroll through and see a bunch of other information. Like there's the memory limit, there's some function, version information, etc. So this is really neat, actually really helpful to understand what's going on with the invocation of the function itself. Right now we just did two kind of print statements to show you how the functions work, but if you were going to build something, you would do all that right here. So if you wanted to, go out and create a record in DynamoDB, or you wanted to, process an image or something like that, the body of the function is where you would do all that work. So that's it for this demo. I will do another one and show you how to do something a little bit more advanced. Okay, here's the last demo of this video. We're going to create a Lambda function that can be accessed via a browser URL. So let's go ahead and go to the Lambda console and click Create Function. We're going to leave author from scratch selected and call this the URL function. We're going to select Python 3.9 from the dropdown and leave everything else the same. We'll click Create Function and then wait for Lambda to do its thing. Once we're on this page, we will make sure that we're on the Code tab, wait for this to load, and then we're just going to change one thing here. Hi from space, whatever. You can put whatever you want there, but just remember what you put in, because we're going to verify that whatever you put in there shows up on the web page that we load our function from. So once you change that message, click Deploy, and this will commit our settings. And then let's head up over to the Configuration tab and make sure we have function URL selected, and click Create Function URL. There's two different authentication options here. The first one is authenticating via IAM, which is something we're not going to get into today. We're going to choose none. Just remember that by choosing this option, anybody can invoke this function, meaning that anybody could essentially incur costs on your account. So if you're just playing around, you can use this option, but do remember to shut down your function after you're done with this demo or this tutorial. And by shut down, I mean delete your function afterwards, okay? So once we choose that option, we do get this little notice that says that they're going to create a resource-based policy per below. So that's something they have to do to make sure that anybody can access this function. Click Save, and this will give us the function URL, okay? So if we just click on this little box with the arrow pointing out, then you should see our message, hi from space. And if we open up the developer tools and click refresh, head to the network tab, we can see this is the function URL, and then we can see the full response. And here it is, hi from space. And that's it. That's how easy it is to create a Lambda function that uses a URL. So let's pop back over to our function page and then go to the functions list. And we see our URL function. Go ahead and delete that now so that nobody can access your function and incur costs on your account. And then when there's a green little check mark next to it, that means it's been deleted. And you can verify in this table as well. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching this whole video. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video if you liked it. I look forward to seeing you in the comments if you have any questions. Thanks.